Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Wilson Center, the official memorial of President Woodrow Wilson, and think tank recently awarded #1 think tank globally for regional studies. I'm Christopher Wilson. I'm the Deputy Director of our Mexico Institute here at the Wilson Center. And we're just delighted to be able to partner with UCLA's Project for Civil Rights and the Migration Policy Institute to present this important research and have a good discussion about this topic. The research being presented today represents really the first systematic study on the impact of immigration enforcement on teaching and learning. It's a topic that is personally important to me. Although it's been many years now, I worked in public schools in Colorado for several years and experienced firsthand the impact on immigrant students of immigration policy and enforcement. Students' parents that were oftentimes afraid to engage while we were trying to encourage parents to get involved in their children's education because of fear that interaction with officials could lead them to interactions with immigration enforcement. Children that had trouble focusing on their education given the uncertainties facing their families, and also a difficulty in motivating kids to take seriously their education and to really push forward with their education, given concerns that given their immigration status, they wouldn't be able to access opportunities that other students had in the future. So I'm really glad to be able to be a part of this important discussion. Also here at the Mexico Institute of the Wilson Center, we've been increasingly concerned about another topic that's addressed in this research, the topic that Bryant Jenson of BYU and Monica Jacobo of CIDE, a close partner of ours, have been working on, looking at Mexican students that are also sometimes US citizens that return to Mexico either through deportations, deportations of family members, or other reasons in terms of return migration, but the challenges that they face as students in Mexico. It's something that's an increasing challenge given the dynamics of migration these days. So I should recognize Ambassador Alberto Farrell, who's the head of the Mexican Cultural Institute, who's here with us today. Thanks so much for joining. We have lots of other distinguished members in the audience, but I'm going to pass things over to our moderator, Shana Sanchez, who has a history as an educator, but also as, of course, a longtime correspondent on education at NPR, who will take things away from here, and I'll just get out of your way so we can have a really good discussion with our researchers and all of you. Claudio?
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having this panel. Very timely, of course. It's great to see so many young people in this room.
Yes.
And I'm assuming that many of you, if not all of you, are here because you have a vested interest in knowing what is going on, what needs to happen. And we have an extraordinary panel that is going to dive deep into this. There's not a lot of heavy lifting for me. So with having said that, I'm going to introduce Patricia Gándara. I'm going to dispense with introductions. You have her, everybody's bios. So Patricia, you're up.
Okay, great, thank you. And let me just say too that we're grateful to the Wilson Center for inviting us, being such wonderful hosts here for this. And I want to mention also that I have our co-author on this paper, Joy E, is in the audience and will join us after the presentations for a lengthy Q&A. So I think everybody's going to get an opportunity to contribute to the discussion. Because educators all over the country are concerned about this particular issue, we have found this is a very live issue around the country. More than 730, in fact, we think more than 750 schools participated in the research that I'm about to tell you about. There were 24 districts in 12 states, and we've gone across each sector of the United States. So we have, I think, what's a fairly impressive sample of individuals responding to our survey. What we found is that those schools that struggle the most, Title I schools, 82% of the schools that responded to this survey were Title I schools. The ones that struggle the most to close achievement gaps are hit the hardest by this enforcement regime. The additional burden of trying to educate children who are often, very often, U.S. citizens and are living in terror of losing their families may simply be too much to ask of our schools and the educators who are themselves stressed by the situation. Stressed sometimes to the breaking point. And it's not just, this is a very important point, it is not just the children of immigrant parents who are affected by this immigration enforcement regime, But in fact, all students in the schools are being, the students in the schools that are disrupted by this fear-inducing tactic which is being used. So I'm going to very briefly tell you what we found, and we can have much more conversation about it later. Overall, we found that schools in the South are the hardest hit by this. We hear more concerns in the South than any place else, and that the larger the percentage of immigrant students, the greater is the impact on the schools. Now, I have got to try to coordinate this. Okay, there's the sample. I have to first say one word or two words about immigrant students. Who do we mean? Immigrant students in the research generally refers to two categories of kids: children who are undocumented themselves, or who are immigrants themselves, not necessarily undocumented, but who are immigrants themselves, having been born outside the country, and those who are the children of immigrants, but who are in fact U.S. citizens themselves. And that's about 88% of the children of immigrants are in fact U.S. citizens. So what have we found? Across all regions of the U.S., 84% of educators noted students expressing concerns about immigration enforcement issues at their school. More than a third indicated that this occurred a lot or extensively. Even young children are worried that their parents will be taken away, that they're afraid that they don't know how to care for their younger siblings. A fourth grade teacher tells us from the Northeast, referring to one of her students, that she told me that her mom is teaching her how to make food and feed her baby sister in case the mom is taken away. I just have to pause on that because this is the kind of thing we heard thousands of times that breaks your heart. Let me move on. Almost 90% of administrators indicated that they had observed behavioral or emotional problems in immigrant students, and 1 in 4, 25%, indicated that this was a very big problem. Huge majorities of respondents recounted examples of fear and anxiety on the part of their immigrant students. One Maryland teacher writes, "We have one student who had attempted to slit her wrists because her family's been separated and she wants to be with her mother. She literally didn't want to live without her mother." And a California high school teacher explained to us, "I had one student who came back the day after prom and would not eat or talk to anyone. I finally found out from one of her friends that she came home from prom to find her mom deported and never had the chance to say goodbye. She was suffering but did not know what to do." Across all regions, about 70% of both administrators and certificated personnel. We did this survey with principals, administrators, teachers, and counselors and psychologists as 3 different categories of individuals who responded. 70% of both administrators and certificated staff reported academic decline among immigrant students, and 1 in 6 counselors reported this to be extensive. A California teacher wrote, "One student's father was deported after 24 years in the country. His children were born here in the U.S., but now the breadwinner is gone." Her grades plummeted after that happened. And many teachers wrote to tell us about outstanding high school students, students who were on track to go into highly selective universities, giving up on school because they no longer saw a future for themselves. Absenteeism is a big problem for schools. Not only do children not learn if they don't attend, but schools lose funding. They find it impossible to improve their test scores and to narrow achievement gaps. Teacher assignments are disrupted, and teachers can lose their job when enrollment declines. And the empty seats that are left in the classroom when these children are taken away are a constant reminder to everyone that some of their classmates are missing. Both teachers and students can experience grief as though a classmate has died, when all of a sudden the student is no longer there and no one knows what has happened to that student. 68% of administrators across all regions reported absenteeism to be a problem, with more than 1 in 10 considering it to be a very big problem. Again, the South was most affected. A Texas teacher wrote, I've heard students saying they don't want to come to school in case their parents get deported. They want to stay together. And a New Jersey administrator added, the kids are scared and sometimes they hide for days when there are immigration raids in the area. Some of the students have no food or place to live because the parents do not have a job and they go day by day. And I think this is something that has not been talked about very much with respect to the children suffering in the schools. People are losing their jobs in these raids. There are also indirect effects on non-immigrant students in Southern schools. In Southern schools, 70% of educators reported this impact, with 15% judging it to be extensive. More than 1 of 7 educators in the South and 1 in 8 nationwide reported that students' learning was being affected a lot due to concerns for their classmates. For many, the ecology of the classroom has been disrupted. One Northern California counselor commented on how the fears of immigration raids had stressed her out. I don't know if it's stressing them, the students, but I feel stressed out about how the San Francisco Chronicle reported possible raids in California. It's a scare tactic which frightens not only undocumented immigrants, but everyone around them. So I am going to have to stop there because we're trying to be very strict on time. We're going to have lots of time for Q&A afterwards.
Thank you. Let's move to Shana Sanchez, University of California, Los Angeles. The title of her presentation, Stressed, Overworked, and Not Sure Whom to Trust, the Impacts of Recent Immigration Enforcement on Our Public School Educators. Shana.
Thank you. Oh, should move this forward. Hi, everybody. I also want to introduce my co-author, Rachel Freeman, who's sitting in the audience, making sure we don't go over time. Thanks, Rachel. So as we've heard from Professor Gandara, ramped up immigration enforcement has had negative effects on our students and public school communities. In this research study, we address a topic that has been absent from the conversation, the well-being of educators, the teachers, administrators, and staff who are serving students with immigrant backgrounds and their non-immigrant peers. So here we explore how educators across the country are affected by the stepped-up immigration enforcement of the last year. And we began our investigation with 2 questions. The first is, how has increased immigration enforcement affected K-12 public school educators across the country who work with immigrant students and their families? And the second is, how has increased immigration enforcement impacted school communities? So, excuse me. As an extension of the larger study on the impact of immigration enforcement shared by Dr. Gandara, we conducted questionnaires and interviews with educators nationwide who indicated an interest in being interviewed further regarding this matter. We gave participants an option of completing an online questionnaire or a phone interview, with both methods asking the exact same questions. The protocol focused on how factors such as stress and anxiety levels, job satisfaction, and working conditions have changed due to the intensification of immigration enforcement and policy changes. Many of the educators in our study reported that they chose to participate in the study because of their proximity to the current circumstances of students. One teacher said, "Because I teach English as a second language, I work completely with immigrant students, and I hear what they're thinking and saying and feeling and experiencing. So it is important for me to take part in this." So in our preliminary analysis, we find that educators are impacted by immigration enforcement in 3 major ways. The first is that they are experiencing an increase in their levels of stress and anxiety. The second is an increase in their workload and a shift in their use of time. And the third is a deterioration in the sense of community and trust in their schools. Our study shows that educators have been deeply affected by the trauma experienced by their students and school communities. So we're going to just talk about our first finding, is that educators are anxious and stressed. We find that changes in teacher well-being are consistent with symptoms of secondary traumatic stress, which is the emotional duress that results when an individual hears about the firsthand traumatic experiences of another. Over 85% of educators in our study report to an increase in anxiety and stress due to their students experiencing increased immigration enforcement. And they also express a sense of helplessness when caring for and protecting their students. The increased stress and anxiety has manifested in negative effects to the emotional, mental, and physical well-being of our educators. An elementary school administrator says, I have found myself lying awake at night, agonizing over whether I should offer to take temporary custody of a child or children in the event that their parents are deported unexpectedly. And that's emotionally exhausting in an entirely new way. Our second finding is that educators are overworked. Over 75%, as Professor Gandara said, of our educators in our sample work in Title I schools, and many worry about their students being vulnerable to immigration enforcement on top of living in poverty and not having adequate resources. So this worry, along with fear, stress, and anxiety, has altered the ecologies of our school, making it more challenging for educators to execute their duties. A community school coordinator says that the increased policies around immigration enforcement have been an enormous barrier, which means that I have spent more weeks working 50 to 60 hours to assure that our community feels safe, to prevent increases in student absences, and to encourage student involvement in education opportunities than ever before. So in addition to their roles as teachers, administrators, and other certified personnel, our educators are taking on more responsibilities and taking more time to seek resources to support their students, causing them to be overworked and at a risk for burnout. Our third finding is that there is a deteriorating sense of trust in schools, and we find this to be true across districts that have made public statements in support of immigrant students and also districts that have not. Many teachers worry that colleagues will not protect their students if immigration enforcement comes to their school. A high school teacher says, "I'm even more careful about what I say to students and what I say to other adults. I've lost trust in some of my colleagues and have a network of trusted colleagues that I go to with these issues." Another teacher says, "Our district policy is protective. Unfortunately, some staff disagree, and I fear that they may act to report students to ICE." So when we ask educators what they would like policymakers to know or do, they express wanting policymakers to stop deporting their students and their students' families. The teacher said it pretty well, and she said, "The policies that are being put in place could result in my kids literally being sent back to their deaths. And I think policymakers need to look my kids in the face if they're going to make a decision like that." So our work offers insight into some of the ways that immigration enforcement has negatively impacted our public school educators, a population for which these policy and procedural changes are not necessarily intended. And just as important, it shows that non-immigrant students are also being harmed by harsh policies meant explicitly for their immigrant peers. Our work further demonstrates what we already know through substantial research. The schools are communities where all members, regardless of immigration status, are deeply connected to one another. Thank you.
Thank you, Shana. Let's move on to Julie Sugarman, Migration Policy Institute. From Playa to Sanctuary Education Policies, promoting a welcoming and safe environment for immigrant families. Julie.
Thank you so much, Claudio, and thank you to Patricia and to all the panelists. The research we just heard about provides a stark illustration of how immigration enforcement can have enormous negative repercussions for children and school communities. And one of the things that's really remarkable about what's happening today is how much it stands in contrast to the core principles of public education. It's important to understand at the outset that schools can't entirely protect children or adults from deportation. Immigration and Customs Enforcement has guidelines not to conduct immigration enforcement inside what are considered sensitive locations, like schools, hospitals, and churches. But those institutions cannot actually protect anyone from being apprehended by any law enforcement, including immigration. But it's equally important to recognize what obligations and opportunities schools have when it comes to creating a welcoming and safe environment for students and their families. Clearly, a more protective stance toward children makes sense in the educational context, just because schools are fundamentally concerned with the safety and well-being of children. But today I'm going to discuss the legal basis for policies that offer protections to immigrant background students. The U.S. Supreme Court has consistently held that when it comes to services that the public can access, non-citizens are protected by the same constitutional rights as citizens. This is the basis for the finding in Plyler versus Doe, which struck down a Texas state law declaring that school districts were only obligated to provide free public education to U.S. citizens and authorized immigrants. This quote on the slide from Justice Brennan's opinion in the case is just one of several passages in his opinion that reject Texas's argument about the financial cost of educating unauthorized immigrants, saying that any burden to the state in terms of finances is outweighed by the central importance of education to the welfare of individuals and society. But what's important about Plyler is not only that it prohibits outright discrimination, but the Plyler decision has been interpreted to prohibit any avoidable barriers to enrollment, including anything that would cause immigrant parents to be fearful of enrolling their children. In 2014, the Department of Justice and the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education issued guidance on the rules around enrollment in response to complaints that they had heard. They provided some explicit examples of things that schools can't do, including asking about immigration status or requiring state-issued ID to determine residency in the district, requiring a birth certificate to establish age, or requiring a social security number. In response, states like New York and New Jersey issued explicit guidance on alternative documents that could be accepted. Around this same time, we were also hearing a number of reports of older immigrant youth, including some with legal status, like refugees, being directly or indirectly steered away from enrolling in comprehensive high schools and toward alternative or adult education. Plyler and other civil rights laws address this, in that not only must schools enroll all students, but schools can't offer a lesser and unequal educational experience to one group of students, even under the pedagogical justification that they won't be able to accumulate enough credits to graduate before they age out of the system, which is at about 20 or 21 in most states. Now, alternative or adult education can be the right choice for some individuals, and some districts have created alternative programs that provide targeted supports to students who need additional help working toward high school graduation. But a lot of the districts that were getting in trouble at this time were sending students to programs that didn't offer services that were equivalent to what they were entitled to in comprehensive high schools. So now we come to what are referred to as sanctuary or safe zone school districts. And I want to thank the NEA for tracking these, and I got this right from their website. Starting very shortly after the election, there were numerous reports of increased absenteeism among unauthorized students, as we've just heard, and students in mixed status families, because parents were afraid to bring their children to school. There was also concern among educators that parents might be less likely to come to important family engagement opportunities. Although this was more because of the presence of immigration enforcement in the community than what any schools were actually doing, this situation clearly violates equal access to education under Plyler and was a legal basis for schools to consider what they had the power to do. Now, a lot of staff, administrators, and school board members were also moved by a sense of solidarity with and concern for immigrants, and by their professional calling to create a learning environment where students and families feel safe and supported. But at the moment, I just want to focus on the fact that the sanctuary school policies that have been enacted over the last year were not intended to challenge the law. In fact, sanctuary school policies, for the most part, reinforce existing federal, state, and local statutes. In addition to reminding the community of the school's obligations, some policies did strengthen and clarify their procedures for how they would uphold the law. Most sanctuary school declarations address a few basic issues. First, schools would only cooperate with immigration enforcement requests if officers had a judicial warrant, subpoena, or court order. There would be a process for school staff to follow to respond to such requests so that district leaders could ensure that any requests were lawful. Third, schools should limit collecting sensitive information. And finally, that schools should provide information to families about their rights. By implementing these policies, schools protect their students' Fourth Amendment rights, namely that when people are in a place where they have a reasonable expectation of privacy, law enforcement can't arrest them unless they have a judicial warrant. These policies also reinforce the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, or FERPA, which bars schools from releasing student information to a third party, including federal immigration officers, without parental consent. California has been a leader in the sanctuary schools movement, starting when the state superintendent issued a letter in December 2016 urging districts to pass such resolutions. In late 2017, the legislature passed Assembly Bill 699, which codified several policies outlined in the superintendent's letter. These included a rule not to collect any information about immigration at any time, which goes beyond the Plyler guidance not to ask about immigration status during the enrollment process. And the bill also instructs schools to avoid referrals to Child Protective Services if a student's parents are detained due to immigration enforcement, and requires districts to educate students on the negative impact of bullying and immigrant parents and guardians on their legal rights. So I've been talking today about law and policy as a way of emphasizing that even though the immigration system is not set up, for example, to protect U.S. citizen children from the harm of being separated from their parents, there are important statutes in federal law that protect children's access to education. What we at MPI have been seeing as we work with districts around the country is how so many schools have stepped up to really take significant steps to build capacity, to get students the resources they need, and to help families address the stress they're under, and to do the best they can to prepare for immigration enforcement actions.
Thank you, Julie. Bryant, you're up next. Bryant Jenson, Brigham Young University. When families are deported, schooling for U.S. citizen students in Mexico. Title of your presentation.
Thank you, Claudio, and thank you to Patricia, to Christopher, and others for organizing this event, and to the other panelists. Great talks we've heard so far. It's an honor to be with you today. Children and youth at the crossfire of our debates about immigration deserve our best analysis and our most thoughtful solutions, and I hope you feel that sentiment here with us today. This includes children who are born in this country, yet are wrapped up in family deportations. Just to reiterate a point that Patricia made, 9 in 10 children of immigrants, documented and undocumented immigrants, are US-born citizens. My comments today focus on schooling for US citizens in Mexican schools. My colleague in Mexico City, Dr. Monica Jacobo, and I have written a paper summarizing the little research that there's been on this in this area, especially focusing on issues of school access and school quality for the growing number of US-born citizen students in Mexico. Our email addresses, you should have those, and if you'd like a copy of the full paper, please just send us an email. Every year since 2009, more Mexican immigrants have been leaving the US than coming to the US, a point often lost in our rhetoric around immigration policy.
On the walls.
This includes deportations as well as voluntary returns to Mexico. Because Mexican migration is traditionally a family affair, increased returns have led to a rapid growth in the number of US citizen students living in and now attending school in Mexico. Projections from the 2015 Intercensal in Mexico indicate that there are currently about 600,000 US citizen students in Mexican schools from preschool to high school, approaching 3% of their total student enrollment in Mexico. So if I can go to slide 2. Here's a map that sort of summarizes, this is from census data comparing 2015 to 2010. During this period, we saw a 29% increase in the number of US-born children ages 6 to 17 in Mexico. These students tend to be younger and are more likely than their peers to live in a rural community. Let me state that in a different way. Concentrations of US citizen students tend to be higher in elementary school than in high schools, and in rural rather than urban communities. And if you know about sort of the Mexican education system, geography or urbanicity is a critical sort of factor in assessing the quality of the school. Access to school in Mexico in general has improved steadily in recent decades. Average education levels among Mexican adults continue to increase year after year, and schooling is now compulsory for all children ages 3 to 17 in Mexico. Thousands of new middle schools, secundarias, have been built to meet enrollment demands, though there are not nearly enough high schools, preparatorias, yet to meet the demand. The current high school graduation rate in Mexico is about 50%, 50. Some institutional barriers in Mexico have made it difficult for families to enroll their US citizen children in school. Until recently, an official state seal, referred to as la apostilla, was required on all foreign birth certificates to enroll foreign-born students. Though this requirement was removed by the Federal Education Ministry in Mexico in 2015, many schools still require it. The change in the law was never coupled with a dissemination campaign or training for local education authorities. The topic has not been a priority for education officials in Mexico, which continues to this day to affect access for many US citizen students there. Like in the US, the quality of schools in Mexico, the quality of teaching and learning is highly stratified by socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, language, and geography. Differences in quality between urban and rural schools are especially stark. Students in rural schools perform several years behind their urban counterparts, Rural schools on average have shorter school days, fewer resources, and teachers with less preparation than in urban communities. This is an important point to make because, like I said earlier, U.S. citizen students in Mexico are more likely than their peers to live in a rural community and attend a rural school. Some research has addressed the preparation of teachers, or the lack thereof, to meet the needs of U.S. citizen students in Mexico. They find language barriers, limited knowledge of the U.S. education system, and curricular disconnects between countries that disadvantage U.S. Citizen students in Mexican schools, especially after recently arriving. One study in Nuevo León and Zacatecas, 2 states in Mexico, found that U.S.-born students were more than 3 times as likely than their Mexican-born peers to be retained a grade in school, reprobados. So what can we do? What is the responsibility of U.S. institutions to our fellow citizens abroad, in this case in Mexico? How can we support the educational advancement of these 600,000 and growing students? First, we have precedent for collaborating. We should revive binational partnerships in education to improve schooling for U.S. citizen students in Mexico. In the past, the U.S. State Department, as well as the U.S. Department of Education, have collaborated with Mexican institutions to design and implement programs to meet the educational needs of Mexican immigrants in the U.S. and their children. I see that the Wilson Center is writing about this, and I congratulate them. We should renew this commitment to develop initiatives that meet the educational needs of U.S. citizen students on the other side of the border in Mexican schools. Second, we should work with departments of education at the state level to forge new partnerships between U.S. and Mexican local education agencies, which is the language we use in our federal education policies. This way, we can communicate between schools and educators across borders to share student information, curricular resources in both languages, and teacher preparation materials. Non-government groups can help as well, like the NEA with this. And lastly, we should invest with Mexican institutions in more research. I wouldn't be a researcher if I didn't say we didn't need more research to improve opportunities for the students we share, a term that many of us have begun to use. To be clear, there is more that we do not know than what we do know about schooling of U.S. citizen students in Mexico. We do know that many aspire to come back to the U.S. to work and go to college, but we do not know how they fare academically compared to their peers, what school leaders and teachers do to integrate them in a variety of school types in Mexico, factors associated with their plans to return to the U.S., and the list goes on. Preparing teachers in Mexico to meet the needs of U.S. citizen students is among the most critical investments in research that we should make. Federal agencies like the Institute of Education Sciences within the U.S. Department of Education should collaborate with Mexican agencies like CONACYT to finance research to build the knowledge base that we need. American students abroad are our responsibility. Our creative engagement with Mexican colleagues and institutions should reflect this important commitment. I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. And parenthetically, I'll plug some of the projects that certainly Patricia has been a part of, titled precisely "The Students We Share" with the Mexican government. And also to mention that at least one story that I jumped on very early on when that process began was the story of Tijuana, which is truly an exception and perhaps a model for the rest of Mexico. Next to Chihuahua, Baja California has had this extraordinary influx of these children, and what Tijuana is doing is worth watching. Before we go to questions, we now have Lilly Aeschylus Garcia, National Education Association, and her comments.
Gracias, Claudio. What an honor to be on such a stellar panel with researchers of the caliber of these panelists and the conclusions that they've reached that are very carefully documented and unquestionable. What I don't have a paper for you. I'm a 6th grade teacher from the great state of Utah. What I want to represent is the heart of my members, the teachers and the education support professionals who look into the eyes of these students every day and who love them and their families. And I'm going to repeat some of the things I think that you heard in the research, but to me, I've heard these teachers talking about the students they like. They didn't fill out a form. They called me on the phone One of my colleagues, Amy Baca-Olart, she teaches in Colorado. She wanted advice. She said, one of my students comes to school every day. This is a kindergarten student with a little suitcase full of what he calls all my special things in case they come to get me. She said, how do I explain to the other kindergartners what he's afraid of? In Arizona, a social studies teacher I know, Marisol Garcia, has taught children whose families were caught up in the raids of Sheriff Arpaio. And she noticed that with the cancellation of DACA, she saw students that had started to come out of their shells all of a sudden getting very quiet and very nervous. And worse, she saw other students start to become bullies and start to say to students who were citizens and had been from families for generations, but they had a name like Garcia or Martinez, or they spoke with an accent, and they were being bullied, being told now they'll send you back. She said, I believe that how America treats our immigrants reflects the values that define us as a nation. How do I talk to my students about American values like this when the President of the United States consistently speaks of immigrants as dangerous criminals? Rachel Sandoval is a second grade teacher, and as Shana was reporting, she's had more than one family come up and say, in case something happens, in case they take me, will you give a home to my child? These are parents who deeply trust the teachers who care for their children. They ask them, will you fill in as a parent for me? And Rachel said, I shouldn't have to talk to second graders, to 7-year-olds about what might happen, about what's the plan if their parents aren't there when they get home. This is the reality of today's classrooms, from preschool to graduate school. The calls coming into NEA on immigration issues have never been higher and never been more frightening. Our schools are the centers of our communities. This is where our kids feel safe. This is where they don't have to pay a fee. This is where they don't have to have expensive clothes. This is where everybody's supposed to be welcome. And there's a lunch and a counselor and after-school programs. And more, we're so thrilled that more and more schools are becoming community schools. They have outreach into social services, into the Boys and Girls Clubs and the YMCA and the YWCA, and the whole community is putting their arms around our students, and they're healthier, they're happier, they're more hopeful. And I remember driving in my car, listening to NPR, of course, when they announced DACA, when President Obama announced the deferred action on childhood arrivals, and I pulled my car over and I just broke into tears. I just started to cry. I never thought I'd see that day when all of these vulnerable, beautiful children could grow up with some hope that there would be a place for them in the country that they love. And now, when we have had something that was working so beautifully, employers loved it, law enforcement loved it, the military loved it, for goodness sakes. No one said, here's a problem we have to fix with DACA. No. In September, Donald Trump, for no reason on God's green earth, no court order, arbitrarily decided to destroy the lives of hundreds of thousands of dreamers who were only building their lives. They had a Social Security card for the first time. They could get on an airplane for the first time. They could get a driver's license. They could apply for a job. They could apply for college. They could join the military. And he declared that on March 5th, that would all be over. We all know now that every day, hundreds and hundreds of those documented young people lose their status and have to fall back into the shadows. He said that he would sign any agreement that Congress came up with. That was not true. They came up with an agreement, and he moved the bar and said, no, now we need more. Now we need money for a border wall. Now we need restrictions on legal immigration. And Dreamers became a bargaining chip in this cynical way. I believe that Donald Trump's agenda is racist. I believe that it is ruthless. White supremacists are congratulating him because they agree with me that it is racist and ruthless. And educators are worried to death about these very vulnerable students and their families, the anxiety, the stress, the bullying that they're exposed to every time they have to turn on the local news and hear about detentions and deportations and raids. Of course it's hard for them to study and do their homework. For the first time in history, the children of our country are afraid of their president. That should give us incredible pause. And they are afraid for good reasons because they can expect no help from him. Oh, thank you so much. These are very kind people. Like, blow your nose, lady. Okay. But it's why they're turning to us. It's why they're turning to their teachers, to someone that they trust. Sometimes it's to the school secretary. We've had incidences where the school custodian has called us, wanting to know how he can help. And NEA is responding to that crisis as several have mentioned. We're trying to put good information, know your rights information into the hands of not just educators, but of parents and community advocates. You can go to neaedjustice.org and find a whole lot of good stuff. It does talk about what districts can do and what they can't do. We've developed a sample resolution that can be presented to a school board. And school boards are actually hungry to get this stuff that has very clear language of what a safe zone should mean. Yes, it talks about the civil right of all students, regardless of immigration status, to that K-12 public education, but it's more than that. It is asking educators, school board members, and the community to commit themselves to ensuring a learning environment for every student, free of harassment, free of fear, free of bullying, and to ensure that this is a place where all students are safe, where they're cared for, where they're respected, and where they're loved. Right now we have over 100 school districts that have already signed a school zone resolution, a safe school zone resolution. Many are considering it even as we speak. NEA has given our legal department the go-ahead to file amicus briefs in court challenges to keep DACA in place. We flooded Congress with hundreds and thousands of emails and phone calls and visits from educators across the country demanding their support for the DREAM Act of 2017, a clean DREAM Act with no games being played. And we have as you saw this week. And it's probably why I'm so emotional, although this is the way I wake up every morning. Yes, I eat tears for breakfast. But we put our lives on the line for our students. We were called to do that again in Florida. And we will do it. We will do anything it takes for our students. These are teachers that I am so proud to represent. I know the names of my members who have agreed to be that foster parent for their own students should something happen to the parents. I took the phone calls from the teachers in North Carolina who, for the sake of saving Wilden Acosta from deportation, when ICE took him when he was just getting on the school bus to go to school, and we got him back. It took almost a year, but we got him back, and we did it because we love them. She's holding up the stop sign. So let me just skip to the bottom line. America is a diverse place. There are families who don't work in the same place, don't go to the same church, they don't vote for the same leaders, but there's this one place in every community where their kids can sit next to each other and sing the ABCs. It's called a public school. It's what was supposed to bring us together as a nation. And we will not let our students down, porque la única lucha perdida es la lucha abandonada. The only fight you lose is the one you give up, and we will never, ever, ever give up on our students. Mil gracias.
Thank you, Lilly. A point of clarification, some would argue that the pressure that had built by the time that Trump was president was that states were ready to sue the federal government to make sure that, that there would be some effort to undo DACA. That's not to excuse or explain why the Trump administration moved so aggressively, but anyway, that's public record. And the other thing that reflects, however, is that in those 20 or so states, to me, America's ambivalence of immigrants or towards immigrants is based on this idea that we're as much a nation of laws as we are of immigrants. And most Americans, at least the ones that I come across, even teachers, is we need to fix the bigger issue of how we receive immigrants rather than get into these firefights over who's legal and who's not, who to welcome, whom not to welcome. And I think that ambivalence is often what has fed this ugly, angry debate. But at its core, it is ambivalence among Americans and their attitudes towards immigrants, even though we are a nation of immigrants. We're going to go to the questions now. I reserve the first question, though, for me. New Bedford, Massachusetts, Laurel, Mississippi, Phoenix, Arizona. In every one of those stories that I did, where ICE had swooped down on a community and taken workers, families, parents, in every case, schools were in an impossible position of having to respond to children who overnight lost their parents. And I'll always remember the story of a young mother in New Bedford, Massachusetts, Guatemalan. Her son was receiving special services because he was autistic. She went into hiding, and their father tried to make it back and died the night he did at her doorstep. And the little boy afterwards, I remember visiting with him, would go to the windowsill, not knowing any better that his father was gone, and always looking for his father to come back. I mean, the stories that come out of this more complex issue are hundreds, if not thousands, of stories that will tear your heart. But I want to ask the panelists, anyone can jump in, what is it that we need to do to open this nation's eyes to essentially a humanitarian crisis, let alone a complex issue like U.S.-Mexico relations, which at this point must be, I don't know, at their lowest ebb? What is it that Americans can do to affect anything that we've talked about here? Any suggestions?
Yeah, I want to say a couple words about that because that is, in fact, what drove this study. We had seen, there's been some very good reporting, Claudio, on the horrors that these children face, but it hadn't been brought into the schools. And our sense was that if we could show this picture inside of our schools, inside of the primary institution for our children in this country, and how it's affecting not just the children of immigrants, but all children and all teachers in these schools, that we might have a chance at affecting people's attitudes about this, to take it one step beyond the individual to the institutional. I don't know. That's what we are trying to do because it does break your heart. And it makes me really question, is this what we're about in America? Is this who we are as Americans? This nation has been created from immigrants. I would point out, though, too, Claudio, that this is the second largest wave of immigration that we've had in the country. It's still not as many immigrants proportionally as we had at the turn of the last century. But it's a very large wave of immigration. And every time in this country that we get a spike in immigration, we also get a spike in this kind of anti-immigrant rhetoric and this sort of ugliness. We have never resolved in this country our attitudes towards immigrants, the very immigrants who we ourselves are the descendants of.
Anything to add, or we can jump into questions? Let's go to the questions from the audience. Is there going to be a mic, or you're going to have to? Oh, good. Any questions out there? Or is everybody too stunned? And tell us who you are.
Yes. Hi, I'm Alberto Farrell, the person in charge of education and culture at the Mexican Embassy and the Mexican Cultural Institute. I thank very much all the presentations, but in particular Bryant's, because I think that in building bridges between the US and Mexico, this doing research on the common people that we share as the territories that we have shared historically is so important. And I think that it's the first time probably that for the US consulates, they have what we have had Mexicans for many years. That's why we have 50 consulates in the US, precisely because there's 35 million Mexican Americans, 11 million Mexicans. And through the consulates, we try to give some services that have to do with education, with health, etc. But yes, for American consulates, for Americans thinking of all those 600,000 US-born kids that when they turn 18, they'll be back here. What kind of citizens are they going to be? What kind of schooling did they have over there? But adding to what the numbers that you present, I think that precisely because migration has to do with regions, it is very important to tackle the issue, I think, by migratory regions. I used to be a consul of Mexico in Minnesota. And for example, a lot of the Mexicans there come from the border of Puebla and Morelos. But there were school teachers in Minnesota going to Cuernavaca, working with the teachers of Morelos, precisely in training them for bicultural, binational, bilingual education. So I think that mapping migration by regions and then trying to, when you were asking, Claudio, what can Americans do, for example, well, let's continue building bridges of collaboration as there are in so many spheres. I wouldn't agree that we're in the lowest point. Maybe there's more collaboration now than ever, precisely because we are worried about the situation on both sides.
Didn't President Peña Nieto this week say that his consulates would become would present a legal argument for protecting Mexicans in this country? Or am I mistaken?
No, I think consulates can only do what the Convention of Vienna allows them to do, but we will continue giving legal referrals, legal assistance,
Right.
as much as we can in terms of the Convention of
Did you have a question, by the way?
No, it was a comment,
Okay.
I'm sorry.
There's a
Or
question.
unless Brian has more information on these regional collaboration strategies that are.
Yeah, I'll just briefly respond if that's okay. I think that the template for past collaborations is a starting point. I think there were also limitations in having educational services based in the consulates in the U.S. We need to collaborate, I think, as I mentioned here, with local education agencies as well. And as you mentioned, one of the advantages of the sort of migration flows historically is that they tend to be sort of communities, not just countries, but communities that immigrate, right? We long know that the strongest predictor of who migrates either way is if they know someone who's already done the trip, right? They migrate in networks. But I think we need to amp up past collaboration efforts. A lot of those programs through the Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores and the IME that was established within the SRE didn't have enough resources to meet the demand. And they were never evaluated very rigorously either. And so those are two things I think that we could do better in the other direction moving forward.
Question up here. Oh,
Hi, I'm Eileen Kugler. I work with schools on engaging families of all backgrounds, particularly immigrant families and students, and have been writing about the impact on schools of the current situation. Thank you so much for this research base that documents this, and particularly the emphasis you've been placing on the fact it impacts every child in these schools. It impacts everyone in these communities. How do you explain to a second grader that their best friend isn't there tomorrow, or their best friend doesn't talk to them anymore because they're worried about their abuela? So it's a huge issue beyond whether that one child has citizenship or their parents have citizenship. And my question is for you, Lilly, because I've also heard you speak on another issue of the day, which is the lack of teacher candidates, the crisis we have for filling our positions, our teaching positions. Anyone who really knows public educators knows this is what they're doing every day. And the stress on them a year ago, when there was none of this, was leading to the crisis, the lack of respect, the lack of funding. You know, as teachers are saying now, you want to arm me with good resources, arm me with a budget that makes sense, arm me with your support and commitment.
Oh, that's just crazy talk.
So my question to you, and I have a question, is, do you see this emphasis on the role of teachers actually motivating young people to step up and say, yeah, maybe I do want to be a teacher? Or, as I fear may be happening, fewer and fewer people want to take the risk of being in that role and dealing with the stress of this and all the other things?
Do you know, and thank you for the question. We'll have a drink when this is all over. You know, I'm from Utah. I don't even know what that means. But here's the thing that I know. We've actually taken surveys of new-ish teachers, people who've been in 5, 6 years or less. They love their work. They love their students. They got into education for all the right reasons. It wasn't the big bucks. It wasn't the summers off. It was, I'm going to change the world. And they're leaving in droves. Not only are we not getting the applicants into the colleges of education the way we used to, they're leaving. And they're not necessarily leaving because of the stress and anxiety. They're leaving because they feel like no one will let them solve the problem. It's like, if you would just get out of my way and let me do what I know I'm supposed to do, but people hold them back. Laws hold them back. Administrators might hold them back. Their own colleagues might say, don't do it. Their own parents are saying, do something easy, go to law school. You know, and that has happened more than once. I cannot tell you how many people I run into who have a law degree who say, I used to be a teacher, but it was too hard. So I went into law. And specifically on this DACA point, I have talked to so many of my members who were so proud a year or so ago to organize DACA clinics, to get those vulnerable parents and families and kids to sit down and listen to this incredible opportunity, to tell them to trust the system and give them their contact information. And now, with this insanity, those teachers have told me, I feel guilty. I feel like I've hurt my students. I should have listened to them when they said, I don't trust the government. And they feel like they have to quit because they did something wrong. They feel responsible for a decision they didn't make. Donald Trump made that decision. But it's layer upon layer, and now we're having discussions about arming teachers.
And the DACA teachers themselves.
Exactly.
Shana, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, we actually, in our protocol, we had a question that we posed to our participants about what they thought about the climate of teaching and in terms of recruiting teachers. And they all were pretty consistent in saying, I think many people who want to teach, this will not stop them. However, it will, as they have been experiencing, make their jobs that's already very difficult, as we know and as you've said, even harder. And it may be not a deterrent, but it may discourage them, and it may, it's just a really dire situation. And so that's a lot of the teachers in our study have expressed that teachers will come and they will teach, but it will be really difficult.
One reminder, there are hundreds of DACA students who are teachers.
9,000.
And we've interviewed our share of those folks. And I mean, talk about another layer to the story. Anyway, we have more questions. There's one here, and then we can go there.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Maria Teresa Sanchez. I am a ESL coordinator in our church. You make me cry because it is true. I think that unless you are there, close to the people that are going through this situation, you really know the dimensions of the problem. But I think that if we change, we cannot change the whole world. It's idealistic to think that. But we can change the world that is around us. And I appreciate your program. I'm aware of the Mexican consulate. We are working still in the process with you people. What I found is that, and I encourage all of you to involve more Americans, volunteer Americans, to teach these people. You will see how their heart change, because some of them were not 100% aware of their situation, but you can tell how they change their hearts. And maybe this voice will pass into another one. It's a small world. My proposal is very small, tiny one. But we must act. We must do something.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a question right behind you, and then, I'm sorry. I'm like, sure you're next. Sorry.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Sam Cervantes. I'm an intern with Forward US. And seeing the recent events in Houston, there was an undocumented student that was bullied constantly, and a girl threw a Gatorade bottle at him, and his reaction was to push her away. But unfortunately, law enforcement in his school and in HISD, instead of helping him for being bullied, he was actually taken into custody by the police, which then triggered his deportation proceeding. And what worries me a lot is that in conjunction with the school-to-prison pipeline that we see in a lot of public schools, I have the fear that a lot of undocumented students will have, one, won't go to their authorities in their campuses, and two, a lot of their issues when it comes to dealing with whatever purposes, teachers are no longer dealing with students at their schools, rather they're being taken to the custody of law enforcement to resolve a lot of issues. So what can be done in order to protect these students in the school policy level from being, unfortunately, taken to jail and then started their immigration proceedings for petty incidents that can be resolved on the school campuses?
So you're talking about the disproportionate criminalization of some of these students. But there's...
Yeah, I think you've provided an opening for me to say something that I didn't get to say in my last comments because I ran out of time. But one of the things that we heard a lot was the desire for legal help and the need to get lawyers into our schools. That's not easy But I think, as Maria Teresa is saying, we can start thinking about this on local levels. Go to your university, the nearest law school, and get volunteers. We know that a person who is represented by a lawyer has 5 times greater chance of avoiding deportation as if they don't have a lawyer. So we need to think about where we have these kinds of resources. Schools are crying for these. They want more information, but they also need some legal help. And I would like to see a movement working in that direction.
Can I just add to that, too? I can tell you exactly what not to do. You don't put a lot of police officers in the school. Police officers deal with crime. They deal with, it's a training. They're not trained to deal with children who are pushing and shoving each other, or who are, we've had reports of police officers arresting kids because they wouldn't get off their cell phone. Those kinds of things. It's disruptive. I would have that kid stay after school. I would not put them in handcuffs and give them a criminal record. And so this escalation of the punishment not fitting the infraction, and the fact that that happens many more times with black and brown children than with white children, many more times with poor children than with wealthier children. What we want to see is, and one of the things we've talked about, is restorative justice training in the schools so that every educator, and that includes teachers and support staff and administrators, really understand how do we de-escalate something, how do we bring kids together and talk about what's happening on a human level. But especially when it involves a dreamer, when it involves an undocumented student, we've actually given thousands and thousands of our folks a little poster with a butterfly on it. You can actually download it from neaedjustice.org, and they put it on their door. And what that says is, if you have any troubles, come and talk to me. You can trust me. We'll work it out. It's dealing with these on a human level.
Julie, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I did. I wanted to mention that I think that, we were talking earlier about changing hearts and minds and what we can do to get the American people on board. And the folks that I think about sometimes are the people who maybe are sort of in the middle on these issues and working in schools, and maybe we're not going to change their hearts or minds, but what we can do is tell them that there are laws and civil rights, and that schools have the obligation to protect students' constitutional and civil rights. And so really giving them the perspective of what policy is saying about the role of schools, and having them see themselves in this role of upholding students' constitutional rights. And so maybe they would think, someone who might not be favorable towards immigrants might stop and say, well, that's my personal opinion, but here in the school, I have this role as being part of an institution that is supposed to protect students, and that is our duty as a school. And so what does that mean for the choice I'm going to make in this particular instance?
Let's go to the question here, and then we'll work our way back.
Hi there. My name is Martin Orjales, and I'm an AmeriCorps member with a group called Edu Futuro that helps in the area with immigrant and underprivileged youth. So one of the things that we've been seeing a lot recently is this fear of putting down your name on a list or being part in these social programs, for example, TANF or SNAP, even the ones that you would think of as necessary, really, really necessary. So I ask all of you, but more pointedly, Patricia, what are some programs or support services that you think are really important to give these people, especially since you have been talking to teachers throughout the country, that what do they see as something that's a requirement for them to have?
88% of these thousands of people who responded to the big survey said we need to have forums in our schools between community and school. We need to reach out to the community and let them know that we've got their back. We need to have these kinds of conversations. And we thought it was very interesting because we also asked, well, have you done this? And relatively few had actually done it. So I think that is one of the, and people who are doing this do it in small groups, in small community spaces where there's not large crowds and people don't have to feel concerned. or they're always feeling concerned, but feel less concerned. So I think that's one of the first steps, is the schools really need to step up and start setting up these forums in their communities with the parents to help them understand what the position of the school is around these issues.
Question here on the edge of this aisle. If you could stand, yes.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Nora Morales, and I'm the Diversity Officer for Prince George's County Public Schools. I have to say that I am a little bit biased, but I'm very proud of our school district. Our CEO, Dr. Maxwell, was one of the first superintendents in the area to send out a message to the community, immigrant community, supporting our students and our schools as safe spaces. I think as a district leader, the challenge has been around the targeting of school districts for offering support of immigrant students. So in our district, I wrote a policy and a procedural document in case any student was approached by ICE, if there were any ICE agents coming to the schools, what we can and what we cannot do. And I'm actually interested from hearing from Lilly around the parameters for school districts, because we've been threatened to have our federal and state funding revoked.
Who's threatening
Legislators.
State legislators have threatened you.
And we are not the only district that is facing that. We have seen our colleagues on the West Coast be threatened by the Trump administration when they are standing up for the rights of students. So our district has approached this issue in a ground roots effort. So we do have partnerships with CASA, CARES, and CARE in the local jurisdictions. We've offered Know Your Rights meetings, but we have a demarcation of what we can and cannot do. And I think it is important for the general public to understand what our position is. We are not allowed to provide legal information at the school building. We can partner with our community agencies and with our county government to host a community event in another separate location, but we cannot provide a legal, we can give you Know Your Rights information, we can give you access to resources, but we cannot have a group of lawyers come to our schools and provide you with direct information. That has been the advice from our general counsel. We have sought, Brian, who is our state attorney general, has provided us some guidance, but considering that in the state of Maryland, our governor refuses to give out a guideline for schools and school districts, we are left to our own to be able to solve this. So if you have suggestions on what we can and cannot do, I would be happy to hear it, because we are in the trenches. And I am telling you, we've just started a partnership with the Archdiocese of the DMV and Catholic Charities to provide a social network of support for our students. So we are actively trying to find grassroots efforts and community organizing efforts to meet the need outside of our school system, but driven by some of our organizing.
So I would
Have you heard about
offer-
this, by the way, Lily? Is this happening anywhere else?
One of the things that's happening all over the country, and go to the Maryland State Education Association, our affiliates all over the country are offering their offices. And remember, wherever there's an NEA affiliate, and there's thousands of them in local school districts, they're offering their offices where you can't have something on the school grounds. And communities are taking advantage of that. And I just beg you, do not buckle under some of the false threats that you will be doing exactly by the book what you are allowed to do, and someone will threaten you with and they don't have a leg to stand on. They're hoping that you'll blink and that you'll pull something back. Don't do it. And honestly, NEA is sending out to all of our affiliates what they can be doing, And we can't do it alone. School boards can't do it alone. The power comes when you bring parents, administrators, school boards, and educators, teachers in those buildings together. And that's when they can't break through.
Go ahead.
I have been really struck by how, in preparing for this, how much misinformation there is around these sanctuary city and sanctuary school policies. Even to me, who does this work, if you had asked me a couple weeks ago, are these sort of, people challenging the law, and I would say, yeah, I guess they must be, trying to, stick it to the man and, try to do something that's illegal. I've really been struck by how these sanctuary campus policies are really within constitutional rights, the Fourth Amendment, the 10th Amendment, the Plyler and FERPA. All of these things provide a really strong legal basis. And so I would very highly recommend to you a particular document that I was reading in preparation for this by the National Immigration Law Center, NILC.org, NILC.org, called The Legal Authority for Sanctuary School Policies. It lays out very, very clearly exactly all of these things that those of us who are not lawyers would not have been able to draw the connections to the Fourth Amendment and FERPA and all those various things. But that really lays out exactly, you can say, no, actually, we don't have to comply with an administrative warrant because in a school you have to bring a judicial warrant. We don't have to comply with an administrative warrant. So there really is law behind this.
We're going to go to the next question, but what you've described in PG County just reminds me of what Arizona went through. Back when the state was challenging the Obama administration, even though at the time the Obama administration was deporting people left and right. But it was this sense of intimidation and literally a policy of attrition that assumed that the more you pressure these folks, the quicker they're going to leave. But anyway, it's, the more we move forward, the more we're reminded of the mistakes we make of the past. In the back, question.
Just another nuance of that issue. In our district, the legal counsel is saying that we can't do the legal clinics for folks in the school out of an interest actually for adhering to Plyler and not creating any knowledge on our part of the students and the parents' immigration status.
And by the way, who were you?
Well, I turned it over so you wouldn't know anyway, I'm Floyd Gomez-Starnes from Montgomery County Public Schools. And I am also proud of our system. I think we do a lot for immigrant families. And I believe that the General Counsel is actually acting in the interest of our families when he's telling us not to create a situation where parents are forced to divulge their immigration status.
And wasn't Montgomery County, though, the place where where ICE deported a soccer player who was about to graduate, and he had already gotten into a college, and he was arrested. I'm not sure if he was arrested on campus or not, but he was deported.
So I apologize that I do not know that.
Was he? Was he a graduate?
What I've seen schools do to avoid that situation is to fold the Know Your Rights into other things and say this is an event about immigration more broadly and what does our district think about this, that, and the other thing, so that other people would be coming, or at least it would seem that it's an event open to the whole community and not just undocumented.
And in addition to that, I mean, we heard from as many teachers who said, I need information because parents are coming to me and asking me, I need this kind of information. So I don't see any reason why anybody has to sign their name to any form to attend these things or to divulge their own immigration status, which we would expect would be varied amongst people who are simply there to support immigrants and those who are immigrants.
Yeah.
Difference between know your rights and then legal clinics, and that's where the line is for us.
Right.
We allow know your rights and in every shape or form because you're right, it's a resource. But we cannot have a team of lawyers providing legal assistance because we cannot assume the liability. We cannot also, for reasons around immigration status, and also because it is considered, and we've been challenged, that it would be a misuse of public funds.
Can you announce that there is a legal clinic next door?
Yes, we do that, and we do partner with community centers to provide that.
There's another question here.
Hi, thanks. This has been incredibly informative. I'm Alex Ashbrook with the Food Research and Action Center, and I wanted to get your response to an upcoming threat on the public charge doctrine, which is a longstanding immigration doctrine that only counts two programs against you, or two types of programs against you in terms of certain immigration statuses. That's TANF and income-tested programs. So the public charge has been leaked. It's not published yet, but the draft has all kinds of programs that would be affected in the public charge determination, including Head Start, all kinds of health assistance. So it would put a real chilling effect on immigrant families accessing these programs, as well as the children of the U.S. Citizen children of immigrant families accessing these programs. So I'm wondering, since schools are so often conduits to helping families access programs, if you all are going to be engaging in this and what we can do to be supportive.
Actually, would you say something? No.
You know, what your comment, I don't know, this isn't something that we have thought about yet, frankly, but your comment reminds me about the many people who talked about the terrible situation in which the children are in outside of school because of job losses, the raids, the fear of raids, the kind of rhetoric in the communities has people losing their jobs, and without the ability to access any public services, as you're talking about, these children are going hungry and they're going homeless.
I have a question for the audience, actually, maybe a show of hands. How many of you are working directly with immigrant kids or parents? That's a lot of folks. Okay, just curious. More questions? Any more questions? Person here? If you could wait for the mic.
Hi, everyone. I'm Fabiola Ramirez. I was actually, I walked over with my family when I was little. And one of the things that was really hard for us was finding the resources. We were caught in Texas, but we ended in Miami, Florida. And only because we had a church that took us in did we get access to the resources. I'm now a graduate student in UB in the University of Maryland, Baltimore in Maryland. And one of the things that I'm researching is unaccompanied minors. I'm connecting right now with a classmate who works for the mayor's office in civil engagement. And one of the things that they're trying to do right now is create a common place, like a one-stop shop for resources for the families, because it's not like really easy for people that come from other countries to know different departments that they can go to obtain the resources they need, right, whether legal, food, housing, anything like that. So I was trying to see if there are any current policies that you might know within the Maryland, I guess, region, Baltimore City, that is helping in this effort, because I know that they're having a hard time establishing this to create a one-stop deal because of the legal, I guess, threats that might come with that, with having one place that people can come to and know that they're going to be present there.
I wonder whether Casa Maryland is
They
very
are
much
connection
in the
with
middle of
CASA.
this.
Yes.
Right. I mean, I don't know if that's a one-stop.
Oh.
But clearly, I mean, they would know, and I don't know how many other groups like that. They're now regional, as you may know. But that's what comes to mind.
Your question actually made me think of the refugee resettlement program and how all over the country there are these different nonprofit organizations that provide services to people that are within the formal refugee program. And even within that, where there are guidelines for them to follow about you need to tell them about this, that, and the other thing, it's very uneven across the country in terms of who gets to know about which services and what's strong in your city and what's not strong in the other city. And, you know, and I think this has been an issue, you know, to some extent because we don't have a national integration policy. We don't have a federal office of immigrant integration, and various, again, cities and states are uneven in that we haven't really considered how to think about this as a whole. And then the refugee issue made me think that Baltimore is also, it's LARS, right? That's where the Lutheran Immigrant Refugee Services is. They don't necessarily serve non-refugee immigrants, but they certainly have a long history with doing this kind of helping folks access services. So you might check with them about the way they approach it for the Baltimore area.
We can squeeze in. I'm sorry. Did you want to add something?
Thank you.
Okay, we can squeeze in a couple more questions, but you know, I'm again reminded that big picture here. Gary Orfield, who's in our audience here in the front, and Patricia have been very much in the middle of documenting and analyzing the data, at least over the last, as we all know, 50 years after the Kerner Commission came out with its report on civil rights issues in this country. Here we are in 2018, yet again revisiting the issues that you know, Americans often forget we have not solved, and that is how ethnicity, race plays such an enormous role in how we treat fellow Americans. Anyway, you know, it's not just this issue because it's part of the larger question in this country that has gone unanswered, and that is how do we treat people from all over the world, which is what this nation is about, and how do we treat them, and what's fair and what's not, and what's political and what's right. Any other questions? There's one on the side here, and then Christopher will go to you.
Hi, my name is Charlotte Healy. I'm a PhD student at University of Maryland. I was wondering, because the impact of immigration enforcement disproportionately affects Title I schools and Southern schools, how do we support these schools? Is it through additional funding and having these schools be a community center, or is it reducing racial and economic and ethnic, isolation in these schools? We're very segregated in these ways, and sort of what are some steps forward with that?
So that sounds like a standardized question. That all of the above, equity, resources, yes. Reducing the isolation. I will tell you that in those schools in our poorest school districts that predominantly serve Black and brown children, that's where you race in with this, let them eat vouchers, give them a ticket to and wish them well in the marketplace that may or may not want to choose them. And so we believe at the National Education Association that you don't divide communities. You don't say maybe a brother goes here and a sister goes there and neighbors don't go to school together. We really do believe in that concept of a neighborhood public school. And we are thrilled that so many communities are wrapping their arms around schools and making them true community schools, where it's, yes, education, and yes, where's the health services? Where's the social services for those parents? Where's the immigration services that you can bring into the schools? Where's the parent home coordinator that knows when a family is in crisis? You make that school the hub of the family and the hub of the community. And you keep the school open so that it's accessible in the evenings for community events and many of the things that we've been talking to here. And that, by the way, does take money, and it's money well spent.
Patricia, you wanted to say something?
Shana wants to say one word, and then I will say one word, and we'll just hand it off to Christopher, right?
So just I have a question, but if we don't have time for it, okay, go ahead.
So just from this paper, and I was thinking about something that a teacher said, that she said, I have like mental health, resources and stuff. What we need are mental health resources for children. When you think about the trauma of removal and deportations, not just on those students, but on the students around them, like Professor Gandra talked about. And when you think about like a death in a school, there's grievance counselors who come in. And so it's just these like mental health implications that are occurring that aren't being met with the proper and adequate resources. I mean, not just for the kids, but even for the teachers, because they can go and, go to a psychologist. But in the school community, like Lilly said, is I think where it needs to occur.
I just wanted to make sure that before we all leave here today, that we bear in mind that there has been a lot of attention given to DACA recently, and with very, very, very good reason. And I'm certain that there's not a single person in this room who doesn't think they would crawl over broken glass, to get a good resolution for DACA. But I want to remind you that even if we were to get a clean DACA bill, as long as these parents are still terrorized by this immigration enforcement regime, the schools will continue to suffer in the same way that we've seen them suffering. We have got to have something that goes beyond, that includes but goes beyond DACA, if we're going to try and give any relief at all to our schools.
Christopher, floor is yours.
So I was going to ask this as a question. I'm just going to make it a closing remark and sort of say it as a statement. But I think we've been talking a lot about the risks and challenges that immigrant students and other students and teachers and administrators all face in dealing with some of these enforcement challenges. I was just, as we were having this conversation, I was also thinking to myself, there's also a lot of opportunity in this. And that's the opportunity that if we get this right, we can have, a huge number of U.S. citizens in Mexico that are bicultural, bilingual, integrated, providing economic advancement and growth opportunities for the country, providing an opportunity for our countries to become more close together through social bonds and connections and shared experiences. And in the United States as well, we know that the immigrants are entrepreneurs in this country. They're people that start businesses in this country. And so, I guess I'm just thinking we're missing out on some of those opportunities by not tackling some of these challenges in our educational system. And it's a huge, it's a huge challenge for us to get there, but it's a huge opportunity should we be able to really do a good job at that. And so I'll just close by saying thank you again to all of you for fantastic presentations.
Remember, tan lejos de Dios y tan cerca de Estados Unidos. Thank you all, panelists. I want to talk to the PG person. There you go.